exposed my wife's secret affair at the neighbor's party. What happened next shocked everyone. It's funny how life can feel so normal one moment, then flip upside down in the blink of an eye. That's exactly what happened to me the night I showed up at a party I didn't even want to go to. I had just wrapped up an exhausting week at work. You know, the kind, emails piling up, endless meetings, and barely enough time to breathe. All I wanted was to crawl into bed and pretend the world didn't exist for a while. But then, out of nowhere, I got a text from Ethan, my best friend. Party tonight, 8 p.m. You'll love it. Don't ask questions. Just typical Ethan, always pulling me into his random plans. I almost ignored it but something about the way he said, "Don't ask questions," made me curious, and honestly, I needed a break. So I threw on a jacket, hopped in my car, and drove to the address he sent. The neighborhood was unfamiliar. Big houses, fancy cars, and places where people sip wine that cost more than your rent. I double-checked the address, thinking maybe Ethan had sent me the wrong one, but no, I was in the right spot. As I walked up the driveway, I could hear faint music and laughter coming from inside. The house was lit up, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but the vibe wasn't the usual upbeat party atmosphere. People stood in little groups, whispering like they were sharing secrets. No one seemed genuinely happy to be there. Then came the first weird moment. A guy near the door gave me this strange look, almost like he recognized me, but he didn't say anything. I shrugged it off and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with low music playing in the background. It was one of those gatherings where everyone looks like they're trying to impress someone, but no one's actually having fun. I grabbed a drink and scanned the room for Ethan. He was nowhere to be seen. Great, I thought, dragged to a party by someone who didn't even bother to show up. As I stood there awkwardly, the lights suddenly went out. A few people laughed nervously, but most of the room fell silent. It was pitch black for maybe 10 seconds, just long enough for your mind to start racing. Then, just as suddenly, the lights flicked back on, and that's when I saw her. Clara, my wife of 8 years, was standing across the room. She was wearing a sleek black dress I had never seen before, and she looked completely stunned, like a deer caught in headlights. But it wasn't just her reaction that hit me. It was the man standing next to Brian. I recognized him from photos she'd shown me of her coworkers. He had his arm draped casually around her waist, like it was the most normal thing in the world. For a moment I froze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of joke? A misunderstanding? But the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Clara wasn't supposed to see me here. And Brian? He didn't even try to hide his smug smile. The room felt like it was spinning. People started noticing the tension. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that her husband? What's he doing here?" I could feel their eyes on me, but I didn't care. What? All I could see was Clara. I took a deep breath and walked toward her. Every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached her, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just looked her in the eye and said, "Clara, care to explain?" Her face turned pale. She stammered something, an excuse maybe, but I wasn't listening. The betrayal hit me like a truck. 8 years of marriage, countless memories, and this is how it ends, in front of a room full of strangers. Brian, still holding on to her like he owned the place, smirked and said, "Hey man, maybe we should talk outside." I couldn't believe his nerve. "Talk," I shot back. "You've already said enough." The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. No one dared to move or speak. The air was thick with tension. Clara's lips quivered like she wanted to say something, but I didn't wait for her to find the words. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding like it was about to explode. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, but it didn't help. My mind was racing. Every moment I'd shared with Clara suddenly felt like a lie. The late nights at work, the unexplained texts, the times she seemed distant, it all made sense now. How had I missed the signs? I got in my car and drove home in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the hum of the engine and the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I wasn't angry anymore. I was just numb. When you're hit with a betrayal this deep, it's not just about losing someone you love. It's about losing trust in them, in yourself, in everything. It's like the ground beneath your feet has been ripped away, and you're left falling, trying to grab onto anything to stop the drop. As I sat in my living room that night, staring at the walls, I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in my head. Why didn't Clara tell me she was unhappy? How long had this been going on? Did she ever love me? Or was it all just an illusion? There were no answers, only a suffocating silence that filled every corner of the house. The home we'd built together, the life we'd shared, it all felt fake now, like a movie set that had been torn down after filming. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind wouldn't stop spinning and my heart wouldn't stop hurting. I knew I had to confront Clara eventually, but not yet. I needed time to process, to understand what had just happened, to figure out what to do next. Because in that moment, I wasn't just a man betrayed by his wife. I was a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if I was going to fall or if I could find a way to climb back back up, leading to the party. There's something eerie about how ordinary life can feel right before everything falls apart. That Friday was like any other. My work week had been hectic, late nights, impossible deadlines, and just enough coffee to keep me going. By the time I clocked out, all I wanted was peace and quiet. But then, as I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, Ethan's text popped up. At first, I didn't even want to open it. I mean, who invites someone to a party last minute without any explanation? But Ethan has this way of pulling you into his chaos. He's the kind of guy who could talk you into jumping off a cliff just to see what's at the bottom. Party tonight, 8 p.m. You'll love it. Don't ask questions, just come. I laughed a little, shaking my. Ethan was always full of surprises, and honestly, I could use a distraction. Still, a part of me hesitated. Clara and I hadn't been connecting lately. She was distant, always caught up in her own world. But maybe this would be good for me. A night out, a change of scenery. The address Ethan sent was on the other side of town, in a neighborhood I didn't know. I almost turned around twice on the way there. The houses were massive, kind you only see in magazines. It didn't feel like a place Ethan would hang out. But hey, who was I to question his plan? When I pulled up to the house, I had this weird feeling in my chest. You know that little voice that tells you something's off? Yeah, it was screaming at me. But I brushed it aside. It was just a party. What could go wrong? The driveway was packed with cars, sleek, shiny ones that looked like they belonged in a showroom. As I walked up to the door, I noticed people milling around outside, whispering to each other. Their conversations stopped when they saw me. It was subtle, but it was their quick glances, hushed voices. I told myself I was imagining things. I mean, these people didn't even know me. The guy at the door barely acknowledged me. He gave me this look like he knew something I didn't, and then stepped aside to let me in. That's when I started to notice the vibe. It wasn't like most parties Ethan dragged me to. There was no loud music, no laughter echoing through the halls. Instead, there was this heavy energy in the air, like everyone was on edge. Groups of people stood in tight circles, talking in low tones. No one looked like they were having a good time. I made my way to the bar, grabbing a drink to steady my nerves. The dim lighting didn't help. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were being watched. I scanned the room, looking for Ethan, but he was nowhere to be found. Figures, I muttered to myself. Leave it to Ethan to invite me to some strange party and then not show up. I leaned against the wall, sipping my drink, trying to make sense of the crowd. Most of the guests looked like they didn't belong together, different styles, different attitudes. It was almost like someone had handpicked random people from different walks of life and dropped them into one room. That's when I noticed something. There were photos on the walls, framed pictures of people I didn't recognize. One of them caught my eye, a group shot of several people, laughing and holding glasses of wine. I leaned in closer, squinting to make out the faces. Just as I was starting to wonder why the people in the photo felt so familiar, the lights flickered. A few people glanced up, but no one seemed alarmed. Then, suddenly, the entire room went pitch black. There's something about complete darkness that makes time feel like it's slowing down. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what was happening. My heart started racing. Were they playing some kind of prank? Was this Ethan's idea of a joke? Then, just as quickly as they went out, the lights came back on, and that's when everything changed. Standing across the room, in the middle of a group of people, was Clara, my wife. She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, sleek, black, and a little too glamorous for her usual style. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. What were the odds that she'd be at the same party? But it wasn't just her presence that threw me. It was the man standing next to her. Brian. I'd only met him once before, at one of Clara's office events. He was her co-worker, someone she talked about occasionally but never in much detail, and yet there he was, his arm casually draped around her waist like they were the stars of the night. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Everything around me blurred as my focus locked on them. Clara looked stunned, her face pale like she'd seen a ghost. Brian, on the other hand, didn't seem fazed. If anything, he looked amused. I gripped my drink tightly, my mind racing. Why was she here? Why hadn't she mentioned this party? And more importantly, why was she with him? The room started to buzz as people noticed the tension. I could hear whispers spreading like wildfire. Isn't that her husband? What's going on? I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't care. My attention was fixed on Clara and Brian. I took a deep breath and started walking toward them. Every step felt heavy, like I was dragging the weight of 8 years of marriage behind me. When I finally reached them, I didn't yell. I didn't make a scene. I just looked Clara in the eye and said, "Care to explain?" Lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Brian, still smug, tried to step in. "Hey man," he said, holding up his hands like he was trying to defuse the situation. "Let's not do this here. Maybe we should talk." I cut him off. "Talk? You've already said enough." The room fell silent, dead silent. You could feel the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Everyone was staring now, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara's eyes welled up with tears, But I didn't wait to hear her excuses. I turned and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, growing louder as I made my way to the door. Outside, the night was cold and still. I stood there for a moment, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. But it didn't help. My mind was a storm, thoughts and emotions colliding in a chaotic mess. How had I been so blind? How long had this been going on? And why did it have to unravel like this? I got in my car and gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady myself. But no matter how hard I tried, the image of Clara and Brian kept flashing in my mind. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was too much. I started the engine and drove home, the road blurring through my tears. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't just angry. I was broke. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, was a lie. And the worst part? This was only the beginning, processing the betrayal. When I got home that night, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. It wasn't just the silence. It was something heavier, something I couldn't shake. Everything around me felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in someone else's life. And in a way, I guess I was. The life I thought I had, the life I thought we had, was gone. I sank into the couch, staring at nothing in particular. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of that night. Clara's face, Brian's smug smile, the way the room full of strangers had stared at me. It all felt unreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. But it was real, too real. The first question that hit me was, how long had this been going on? Were there signs I'd missed? Looking back, it all started to add up. The late nights at work, the sudden text messages she'd brush off, the times she seemed distracted or distant. It was all there, but I hadn't seen it. Or maybe I didn't want to. Do you ever have those moments where your brain just won't let you stop? Like it's piecing together a puzzle you didn't even know existed? That's what happened to me that night. I started going over every little detail from the past few months, past few years. Every argument, every odd excuse, every time she seemed a little too eager to leave the house. It was like watching a movie where you already know the twist, but now you're spotting all the clues you missed the first time around. And the more I thought about it, the more the anger started to build. Not the kind of anger that makes you yell or throw things. No, this was deeper. It was a quiet, seething rage that just sat there, burning in your chest. I wasn't just angry at Clara. I was angry at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let this happen? I looked around the living room, and suddenly everything felt fake. The photos on the wall, the wedding picture on the mantel, the little souvenirs from trips we'd taken together. They all felt like lies, like props in a story I'd been stupid enough to believe. I picked up one of the photos, a picture of us on our anniversary. We were smiling, holding hands, looking like the perfect couple. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out when things had started to change. Was it before this picture? After? Did she ever really love me? Or was that just another lie? I wanted to smash the photo. I wanted to throw it across the room and watch it shatter. But I didn't. Instead, I put it back on the table and sat there, letting the weight of everything sink in. At some point, my phone buzzed. For a second, I thought it might be Clara. But it wasn't. It was Ethan. "Hey man, you okay? Heard things got rough tonight?" I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? That I'd just watched my entire life fall apart in front of a room full of strangers. That I wasn't okay and probably wouldn't be for a long time. I turned off my phone and tossed it onto the couch. I couldn't deal with anyone else right now. I could barely deal with myself. Hours dragged by. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara and Brian together. I heard the whispers from the party, felt the stares of the guests, tasted the bitterness of betrayal. It was like a loop I couldn't escape, playing over and over again in my head. By the time the sun came up, I felt like a shell of myself. I didn't know what to do or where to go from here. Part of me wanted to confront Clara, to demand answers, to make her explain how she could do this to me. But another part of me didn't want to face her at all. I didn't think I could handle hearing her try to justify what she'd done. So I sat there, lost in my own thoughts. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, it all swirled together, making it impossible to think straight. All I knew was that things would never be the same again. Later that day, Clara finally reached out. It was a text, not a call. Just one word: sorry. Sorry? That was it. Sorry didn't even begin to cover what she'd done. Sorry didn't undo the betrayal, the humiliation, the broken trust. But even so, I stared at that text for what felt like forever, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? It's okay? Because it wasn't. It wasn't even close to. But the text kept sitting there, staring back at me, daring me to reply. And eventually I did. When did it start? Her reply came almost instant. A few months ago. A few months. That was all it took to destroy 8 years of marriage. 8 years of love, trust and commitment have gone in a matter of months. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or laugh at the absurdity of it all. I typed back. There was a long pause before her next message came through. I don't know. I wasn't thinking. It just happened. It just happened. Like she'd tripped and fallen into Brian's arms by accident. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Instead, I set it down and took a deep breath, trying to keep myself from spiraling. That was the thing about betrayal. It wasn't just about what they did. It was about what it made you question. Was I not enough? Was it something I did? Or was this just who she really was all along? I didn't know the answers to any of those questions. All I knew was that I couldn't keep sitting here, drowning in my own thoughts. I needed to do something, anything, to take back control of my life. The next day, Clara texted again, asking to meet in person. At first, I didn't want to. I didn't think I could face her without breaking down. But then I realized I needed to. Not for her, but for me. I needed answers. I needed closure. I agreed to meet her at a cafe, a neutral place where I could keep my emotions in check. As I walked in, I spotted her sitting at a table in the corner, her head down, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. She looked up when she saw me, and for a moment I thought I saw regret in her eyes, but regret wasn't enough. Not anymore. I sat down across from her, folding my hands on the table. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. Why? Her voice was shaky as she tried to explain. She said she'd felt lost, trapped, like something was missing in her life. She said Brian had been there for her when she felt like I wasn't. She said a lot of things, but none of it felt like a real answer. Do you love him? I asked. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I didn't say much after that. I just sat there, letting her words wash over me. When she finally finished, I stood up, looked her in the eye, and said, I don't know what happens next, but I do know this: you broke something that can't be fixed. Then I walked out, leaving her sitting there alone with her coffee and her excuses. Clara's confession. I thought meeting Clara would give me answers, but all it did was open more questions. Her words kept playing in my head over and over. She said she felt lost. She said Brian had been there for her in ways I hadn't. But how was that supposed to make any of this okay? And then there was the hesitation when I asked if she loved. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. For the next few days I avoided her. She sent texts, long ones, full of apologies and excuses, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I didn't even read most of them. I just couldn't handle it. The wound was still too fresh, and every message felt like rubbing salt into it. But then, one evening she called. I stared at my phone, watching it buzz on the coffee table. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but another part of me couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was the hope that she'd finally say something that made sense, something that would make the pain a little easier to bear. I picked up, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things we didn't know how to say. Finally she broke. Can we talk? Please. Her voice was shaky, like she was on the verge of tears. I didn't want to agree. I didn't want to see her. But I also knew I couldn't keep running forever. If I wanted to move forward, whatever that meant, I needed to face her. So I agreed. We met at a park not far from our house. It was one of those places we used to go when we first started dating. Back then, it had felt like our little escape from the world. Now it just felt empty. Clara was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench under a tree. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she barely looked up as I walked over. I sat down next to her, leaving just enough space between us to make it clear this wasn't a friendly chat. For a while, neither of us spoke. I think we were both waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes glassy with tears. Oliver, I'm so sorry. It was the first time she'd said it in person. For a second, I almost believed her. But then I remembered everything: the party, Brian, the lies, and the anger came rushing back. Sorry for what I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. For cheating? For lying? Or for getting caught? She flinched at my words, but I didn't feel bad. She'd hurt me more than I thought anyone ever could. The least she could do was hear the truth. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said soft, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't plan any of this. I shook my head. You don't accidentally cheat on someone, Clara. You don't accidentally end up in someone else's arms. So tell me, how did it happen? She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she took a deep breath and started talking. It had started a few months ago during a work trip. She and Brian had been working late on a project, and one night, after too many drinks, they'd crossed a line. She swore it wasn't planned, that it wasn't something she'd been looking for, but once it started, she couldn't stop. She said she felt alive with him in a way she hadn't felt in years. I wanted to interrupt her, to tell her how ridiculous that sounded, but I let her keep talking. I needed to hear it all, even if it hurt. She said she'd felt like we'd been drifting apart for a long time, like we were just going through the motions. She said she didn't know how to fix it, and when Brian started paying her attention, she got caught up. She said she wasn't trying to hurt me, but she knew and she didn't know if she could ever make it right. When she finally stopped, I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at her, trying to process everything she'd just told me. It didn't make sense, but maybe that was the point. Maybe betrayal never makes sense. "Do you love him?" I asked again, even though I already knew the answer. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. "I thought I did," she admitted. "But now, I don't know." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She thought she did. She wasn't even sure. All of this, everything we'd built together, was destroyed for something she wasn't even sure about. I stood up, running a hand through my hair. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Do you even understand how much this has hurt me?" She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I do," she said, "and I'm so sorry. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to make things right. Please, Oliver." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment I almost believed she meant them. But then I thought about Brian. I thought about the months of lies, the times I'd asked her if something was wrong and she'd brushed me off. I thought about the party, the humiliation, the way she'd let me walk into that trap without warning. "No," I said finally, "you don't get to ask for forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever." Her face crumpled, and for a second I almost felt bad. But then I reminded myself that she'd done this to herself, to us, and there was no going back. I walked away from that park feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I'd finally confronted her, and finally got some of the answers I'd been looking for, but heavier because those answers didn't make anything better. They didn't fix the pain or the betrayal. If anything, they made it worse. For the first time, I realized this wasn't something I could just move past. This wasn't something a few apologies and promises could fix. It was bigger than that, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her, let alone trust her again. As I drove home, I started thinking about what my life would look like without Clara in it. It was a thought I'd never let myself entertain before, but now it felt inevitable. How could we rebuild something that had been so thoroughly destroyed? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear: the life I thought I had was over, and I had to figure out what came next. Meeting Lauren. A few days after my conversation with Clara, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I mean, how much worse could it get? My marriage was in shambles, my trust in people was completely broken, and I couldn't even sleep without reliving the betrayal over and over in my head. But life has a funny way of showing you just how far down the rabbit hole can go. I was at a coffee shop, sitting in the corner with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. I wasn't really there to drink coffee, though. I was there to escape the house, the memories, the silence. It was one of the only places where I could sit without the weight of everything crushing me. That's when she walked in. At first, I didn't recognize her. She was wearing sunglasses, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked tired, like someone who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for too long. She ordered her drink and then turned, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. Her face lit up with a mix of recognition and something else I couldn't quite place. She walked over, and as she got closer, I realized who she was. Lauren, Brian's wife. "Oliver, right?" she asked, her voice cautious but kind. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "What do you even say to someone in a situation like..." "Yeah, and you're..." "Lauren," she said, pulling out the chair across from me. "Do you mind if I sit?" I shook my head, still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that she was here, sitting in front of me. The last time I'd seen her was at some company event Clara had dragged me to. Back then, she and Brian had seemed like the picture-perfect couple. Funny how appearances can be so deceiving. She took a sip of her drink before setting it down and looking at me. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice soft. "About the party. About Clara and Brian." The mention of their names made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "Yeah," I said simply. "It's been a rough few weeks." She nodded, her eyes filled with an understanding that caught me off guard. "I know what you're going through," she said. "Believe me, I do." I raised an eyebrow. "So you knew?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked down at her coffee. "Not at first," she admitted, "but I started to suspect. Brian's been distant for months, always working late, always glued to his phone. I thought I was just being paranoid, but then I found some things, messages, pictures." She paused, her voice catching on the last word. I could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain I'd been carrying since the night of the party. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a genuine question. "I wanted to," she said. "I almost called you a dozen times, but I didn't know how, and I didn't want to believe it. I guess I was hoping I was wrong. I nodded because I knew exactly how she felt. Denial is a powerful thing. It lets you cling to the illusion of normalcy, even when everything around you is falling apart. For the next hour we sat there, talking like two people who had been shipwrecked and washed up on the same deserted island. She told me about the little things that had tipped her off Brian's sudden interest in his appearance, and the way he'd started keeping his phone locked at all times. I told her about Clara's late nights, the distant look in her eyes, and the way she always seemed to have some excuse. It was strange to open up to someone I barely knew, but Lauren understood in a way no one else could. She wasn't just sympathetic, she was living it. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I didn't feel so isolated. Then she said something that stopped me in my track. "Oliver, there's something else you should know." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening before leaning in closer. "It's not just an affair," she said quietly. "It's bigger than that." My heart started to race. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated like she was trying to find the right words. "Brian's been lying to me about more than just Clara. He's been moving money around, draining accounts, making investments that don't make sense. I've been going through the bank statements and I think Clara's involved." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. It was one thing to know Clara had cheated. That was bad enough, but to think she'd been helping Brian manipulate our money was a whole new level of betrayal. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. "I wish I wasn't, but the numbers don't lie." The rest of our conversation was a blur. Lauren showed me some of the evidence she'd gathered: bank transfers, suspicious emails, screenshots of messages between Clara and Brian. It was overwhelming, like being hit with a tidal wave of information I wasn't ready to process. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just about love or trust. It was about something much darker. Clara and Brian had been working together, not just to betray us emotionally but to take advantage of us financially. And if we didn't do something, they were going to get away with it. By the time we left the coffee shop, Lauren and I had made a decision. We weren't going to let them win. We were going to fight back. Over the next few days, we started piecing together a plan. Lauren had already done a lot of the groundwork, gathering documents and evidence. I added what little I could: texts, emails, anything that might help build the case. It wasn't easy. Every time I opened my laptop to look at the files, I felt sick to my stomach. Seeing Clara's name next to Brian's, reading their messages, seeing how calculated they'd been, it was almost too much to handle. But I pushed through because I knew I couldn't let them get away with this. Lauren and I became an unlikely team. We weren't friends exactly. There was too much pain and too much history for that. But we were partners, bound together by a shared goal and a shared betrayal. And the more time I spent with her, the more I realized how strong she was. She wasn't letting this break. If anything, it was making her stronger. And that gave me hope that maybe someday I could feel the same way. One night, as we were going over some of the evidence, Lauren looked up at me and said something that stuck with me. "You know," she said, "we're not the only ones this has happened to. There are so many people out there who've been betrayed, hurt, and left to pick up the pieces. Maybe after this is all over, we can do something to help them." Her words caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on my own pain and my own anger that I hadn't even considered the idea of turning this into something positive. But she was right. We weren't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, we could turn our pain into something meaningful. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt a glimmer of hope. Confronting the betrayer. The plan to confront Clara and Brian wasn't something Lauren and I took lightly. We knew it had to be calculated. Every step had to be precise. If we rushed it or let emotions take over, they'd slip through our fingers. This wasn't just about justice for what they did to us emotionally. This was about holding them accountable for their lies and manipulation. It was late one evening, and Lauren and I were sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers, screenshots, and notes. The weight of what we were about to do hung heavy in the air. Lauren sipped her coffee, her hands trembling slightly. I wasn't sure if it was the caffeine or the nerves. "Do you think they even realize we're onto them?" I asked, breaking the silence. Lauren shook her head. "Brian's cocky. He thinks he's untouchable. And Clara," she hesitated, her expression hardening. "Clara probably assumes you'll just roll over and let this slide." Her words stung, but they also lit a fire in me. She was right. Clara knew me as the guy who avoided conflict, the guy who always tried to keep the peace. But this wasn't something I could forgive. Not this time. We had everything we needed: bank statements showing the transfers, emails detailing their schemes, and even some of the texts Lauren had found that outlined how they planned to cover their tracks. The picture was clear: they weren't just having an affair. They were planning to use us to fund their little fantasy. The next step was deciding how to confront. Lauren suggested we do it in public, someplace neutral where they couldn't cause a scene. At first I wasn't sure. The idea of airing our dirty laundry in front of strangers made me uncomfortable. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If we confronted them in private, they'd have room to manipulate, to twist the narrative. narrative. Public setting meant accountability. We chose a small cafe on the edge of town. It was quiet, out of the way, but still public enough to give us some security. Lauren texted Brian, and I messaged Clara asking them to meet us there. Neither of us gave any details about why. We didn't want to tip them off. On the day of the confrontation, I could barely sit still. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my stomach felt like it was tied in knots. I kept going over the plan in my head, imagining every possible outcome. What if they denied everything? What if they caused a scene? What if they just walked out? Lauren must have noticed my anxiety because she placed a hand on my arm and said, "We've got this. They don't see us coming." Her confidence steadied me, even if just a little. When Clara walked into the cafe, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. She spotted me immediately, her expression shifting from surprise to something that almost looked like guilt. Almost. Brian followed close behind, his usual smug demeanor firmly in place. He didn't even glance at Lauren as he sat down across from her. "What's this about?" Brian asked, his tone casual, like he wasn't sitting across from the two people he'd betrayed. Clara, on the other hand, seemed nervous. She kept fidgeting with her bag, her eyes darting between me and Lauren. "Oliver, what's going on?" she asked, her voice shaky. I exchanged a quick glance with Lauren before pulling out the folder we'd brought. I placed it on the table between us, letting the weight of it speak for itself. "What's this?" Brian asked, reaching for evidence. Lauren said firmly, her voice steady despite the tension. "Of everything you've been doing. The affair, the money, the lies. It's all in there." For the first time, Brian's smug expression faltered. He opened the folder, flipping through the pages, his face growing paler with each one. Clara leaned over to look, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw the bank statement. This isn't what it looks like," Brian stammered, his confidence cracking. "You're overreacting," I said, my voice rising. "You've been stealing from us, lying to us, using us, and you think we're overreacting?" Clara looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Oliver, I didn't know about the money. I swear I didn't." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear it. You knew what you were doing. Maybe you didn't know about the money, but you knew about the affair. You knew how much this would hurt me, and you did it anyway." She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't done. "You don't get to play the victim here, Clara. Not after everything you've done." Brian tried to shift the blame, of course. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that we'd taken things out of context, but Lauren wasn't having it. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I've seen the messages, I've seen the plans. You're not getting out of this." For a moment, it looked like he was going to argue, but then his shoulders slumped, and he leaned back in his chair, defeated. "So, what now?" he asked, his tone bitter. Lauren and I exchanged another glance. This was the part we'd rehearsed, the part that would decide how this all played out. "What happens next is up to you," Lauren said. "You come clean, you return the money, and you stay out of our lives. Or we take everything we have to the authorities." Brian's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. "Do you really want to test that theory?" The silence that followed was deafening. Clara looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown, her hands trembling as she stared at the table. Brian, on the other hand, was clearly calculating his next move. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, we'll fix it." It wasn't the resolution I'd imagined, but it was enough. They agreed to return the money, to stay away from us, to face the consequences of their action. It wasn't justice, but it was a step in the right direction. As Lauren and I left the cafe, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. We still had a long road ahead, but at least we'd taken back some control. At least we'd stood up for ourselves. "You did good in there," Lauren said as we walked to our... "So did you," I replied. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled, and for the first time it wasn't a sad smile. It was a hopeful one, and in that moment I realized we weren't just survivors. We were fighters, and we weren't done yet, building a new path. After the confrontation, things didn't magically get better. I wish I could say that walking out of that cafe felt like the end of the story, but it wasn't. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one I wasn't sure I was ready for. For weeks, I felt like I was floating through life, disconnected from everything around me. Every morning I'd wake up hoping the pain would be less intense, but it wasn't. The betrayal still stung and the anger still burned, but underneath it all, there was something else: emptiness. The life I thought I'd built was gone, and I had no idea what to do with the pieces. Lauren reached out a few days after the confrontation. She wanted to check in and make sure I was okay. We ended up meeting at the same coffee shop where we'd first talked. This time, the mood was lighter, not happy exactly, but not as heavy as before. "How are you holding up?" she asked as she stirred sugar into her coffee. I shrugged. "Better than I was. Worse than I'd like to be." She nodded, giving me a small, knowing smile. "It's a process." For a while, we just sat there, sipping our drinks and talking about everything and nothing. It was comforting being with someone who understood what I was going through, someone who wasn't trying to fix me or tell me to move on, but just listened. At some point, the conversation shifted. We started talking about what we wanted to do next and how we were going to move forward. Lauren mentioned an idea she'd been toying with, starting a support group for people who had gone through similar betrayal. There are so many people out there who feel like they're alone, she said, but they're not. And maybe if they had a place to share their stories, it would help. I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. It was a good idea, but it also sounded daunting. Do you really think people would want to open up like that? I asked. She shrugged. I think it's worth a shot. If nothing else, it gives us something to focus on, a way to turn all this pain into something positive. I couldn't argue with that. The thought of helping others, of finding some kind of purpose in the chaos, was appealing. It felt like a way to take back control, to make sense of something that didn't make sense at all. Over the next few weeks, we started laying the groundwork. We found a small community center that was willing to let us use one of their rooms for free. We made flyers, set up a website, and even created a social media page to spread the word. At first, it felt strange, almost surreal. Who were we to run a support group? We were just two broken people trying to figure out our own lives, but the more we worked on it, the more it felt right. The first meeting was nerve-wracking. We didn't know if anyone would show up, and part of me was secretly hoping they wouldn't. But to my surprise, a handful of people trickled in. They were hesitant at first, unsure of what to expect. But as the meeting went on, something incredible happened. People started sharing their stories. There was a woman who'd found out her husband had been living a double life, a man whose best friend had stolen from him, a young guy who'd been betrayed by his business partner. Each story was different, but the emotions were the same: hurt, anger, confusion, sadness. And as they spoke, I realized something: we weren't just helping them, they were helping us too. The group became a weekly thing. Every Thursday evening, we'd gather in that little room, sharing our stories, our struggles, and our victories. Some nights were heavier than others, but every time I walked out of that room, I felt lighter, stronger, like maybe, just maybe, I was going to be okay. Lauren and I also started spending more time together outside of the group. At first, it was just planning meetings or grabbing coffee to brainstorm ideas, but over time, it became more than that. We'd go for long walks in the park, talking about everything from our childhoods to our dreams for the future. She had a way of making me laugh, even when I didn't think I could, and for the first time in a long time, I started to feel hopeful. One day, after a particularly emotional meeting, Lauren turned to me and said, "You know, we could do more." I frowned. "More? What do you mean?" She hesitated, like she wasn't sure how to say what she was thinking. "The support group is great, but it's small. What if we could help more people? What if we started something bigger?" "Bigger how?" I asked. A non-profit," she said, her eyes lighting up. "Something that helps people rebuild their lives after betrayal, whether it's through counseling, financial resource, or just a place to connect with others who understand." The idea took me by surprise. A non-profit. It sounded ambitious, almost impossible, but the more we talked about it, the more it started to feel like the natural next step. We'd already seen how much the support group was helping. Why not take it further? We started small. Just like with the support, we filed the paperwork, came up with a name, the Phoenix Foundation, and started reaching out to people who might be interested in help. To our surprise, the response was overwhelming. People wanted to be a part of it. They wanted. Slowly but surely, the foundation started to take shape. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, challenges, and moments when we wondered if we were in over our heads. But every time we thought about giving up, we reminded ourselves why we started. This wasn't just about us. It was about everyone who had ever felt broken, betrayed, or lost. It was about showing them that they weren't alone and that there was a way forward. Through it all, Lauren and I became closer. At first, it was just a friendship, a partnership born out of shared pain. But over time, it started to feel like something more. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first. After everything I'd been through, the idea of opening my heart again was terrifying. But Lauren wasn't Clara. She wasn't someone who took, she was someone who gave. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could trust someone completely. We didn't rush into anything. We took our time, letting things develop naturally. And as we worked together to build the Phoenix Foundation, we built something else, too, something real. Something strong, something I never thought I'd have again. Looking back, I never could have imagined how much my life would change after that night at the party. What started as the worst experience of my life had led me to something beautiful, something meaningful. It hadn't been easy, and the scars were still there. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and I wasn't alone. Growth and new beginnings. If someone had told me a year ago that my life would look like this, I wouldn't have believed them. Back then, I was living in what I thought was a solid, predictable routine, a steady job, a happy marriage, a clear path forward. And then, in a single night, it all fell apart. It's funny how betrayal can feel like the end of everything. But now, looking back, I realize it was just the beginning of something new. The Phoenix Foundation grew faster than Lauren and I ever expected. What started as an idea scribbled on a napkin during one of our late-night planning sessions conversations quickly turned into something real. The support group meetings expanded, and we started offering more resources, counseling services, financial advice, and even workshops for rebuilding trust and setting boundaries. Word spread, and before we knew it, we were helping people from all over the city. It wasn't easy. There were moments when we felt completely overwhelmed, like we were in way over our heads. Running a nonprofit is a lot of work, and neither of us had any experience. There were late nights, stressful meetings, and plenty of times when we wondered if we were making any difference at all. But then we'd get a message from someone who'd attended one of our sessions, a thank you note, a story about how the foundation had helped them take the first step toward healing, and it reminded us why we started. One of those messages came from a man named Jeremy. He showed up at one of our meetings, sitting quietly in the back of the room. He didn't say much at first, just listened as others shared their stories. But when he finally spoke, his words left an impact. Jeremy had been betrayed by his business partner, the person he'd trusted most in the world. It had left him not just financially broken, but emotionally shattered. He talked about how he'd spent months trying to pick up the pieces, feeling like he was drowning in shame and anger. But then he found our group, and for the first time he felt like he wasn't alone. "You helped me realize I'm not broken," he said, "just bent, and bent things can be straightened again." That hit hard, because that's exactly how I'd felt when this journey began, like I was broken beyond repair. But Jeremy's words reminded me of something Lauren and I had talked about from the beginning. Healing doesn't mean going back to who you were. It means becoming someone new, someone stronger. Lauren and I continued to grow the foundation, but we also started growing something else, our relationship. At first it felt strange, almost like we were crossing a line we shouldn't, but the more time we spent together, the more natural it felt. It wasn't like falling in love, it was like finding something you didn't know you were looking for. She wasn't Clara, and that was a good thing. Lauren was steady, kind, and real in a way that Clara never had. She didn't play games or hide behind excuses. She was honest about who she was and what she wanted. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be honest too. We took things slow, partly because we were both still healing, but also because we didn't want to rush into something we weren't ready for. It wasn't about filling a void or distracting ourselves from the past. It was about building something real, something solid, and as the months went by, that's exactly what we did. One day, as we were packing up after a particularly emotional meeting, Lauren turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "we've spent so much time helping others move forward. Have you ever stopped to think about how far we've—" I paused, her words catching me off guard. I hadn't thought about it like that before. I'd been so focused on the foundation, on helping others, that I hadn't taken the time to reflect on my own journey. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I guess I have." We sat down, surrounded by stacks of chairs and leftover coffee cups, and started talking about everything we'd been through. The betrayals, the anger, the nights when it felt like the pain would never end. But also the moments of growth, the little victories, the things that reminded us we were stronger than we thought. By the time we finished talking, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. The foundation continued to grow, and so did our relationship. We started hosting bigger events, bringing in guest speakers, and even partnering with other organizations to expand our reach. We weren't just helping people rebuild their lives, we were building a community of resilience and hope. One of our biggest events was a fundraiser we called Phoenix Rising. It was a night of music, stories, and celebration, bringing together people from all walks of life who had overcome betrayal and heartbreak. Standing on that stage, looking out at the crowd, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for how far we'd come, but for the people who had helped us get. Lauren was standing next to me, her hand resting lightly on mine. We shared a quick glance, and in that moment I realized something important. This wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about embracing the future. As the years went by, the Phoenix Foundation became more than just a nonprofit. It became a symbol of everything we'd been through and everything we'd overcome. We helped hundreds of people, maybe even thousands, and in doing so, we helped ourselves. But more than that, it became a reminder that no matter how broken you feel, there's always a way to rebuild. You just have to be willing to take the first step. Lauren and I eventually moved in together, and later we got married. It wasn't something we rushed into, and it wasn't about replacing the lives we'd lost. It was about creating something new, something stronger. Our wedding wasn't flashy or over the top. It was simple, surrounded by the people who had supported us through everything. And as I stood there, looking at Lauren, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: joy. Looking back on everything, it's hard to believe how far I've come. That night at the party felt like the end of the world, but it was really the start of something much bigger. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I didn't think I'd make it, but I did. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that even in your darkest moments, there's always a way forward. You just have to find it. Reflection and call to action. If you'd asked me when this all started and whether I thought I'd ever find peace, I would have said no. Back then, the pain of betrayal felt too big, too heavy. It was like carrying a weight I couldn't put down. But now, sitting here and looking back on everything, I see things differently. That betrayal, as painful as it was, didn't end my story. It started a new one. It's strange, isn't it? How the worst moments of your life can lead to something so much better. At first, it doesn't feel that way. At first, all you feel is the hurt, the anger, the confusion. You ask yourself all these questions. You don't have answers to why me. What did I do wrong? How am I ever going to move forward? But the thing is, moving forward isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking one step at a time, even when you don't know where the path is leading. It's about trusting that somewhere, somehow, there's something better waiting for you on the other side of the pain. For me, that something better was the Phoenix Foundation. It was meeting Lauren, building a life that was stronger and more fulfilling than anything I'd ever imagined. But none of that would have happened if I hadn't hit rock bottom first. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find out what really matters. Looking back, there were a few things that helped me get through it all, and I want to share them with you in case you're going through something similar. First, let yourself feel the pain. I know it's tempting to push it down, to pretend it's not there, but healing doesn't happen that way. You have to face it, as hard as that is. Let yourself cry. Let yourself scream. Let yourself be angry. It's okay to not be okay for a while. Second, don't go through it alone. Whether it's a friend, a family member, or even a support group like the one Lauren and I started, find people who will listen and will remind you that you're not alone, because you're not. There are so many people out there who've been through what you're going through, and when you share your story, you realize just how strong you really are. And finally, focus on what's ahead. The past can teach you, but it can't define you. Your life isn't over because of what happened. It's just beginning. Use the pain as fuel to build something better. Find your purpose and your passion and let that guide you forward. I'll be honest, there were times when I wanted to give up. Times when it felt like the pain was too much, like I'd never feel whole again. But I'm glad I didn't, because on the other side of that pain, I found strength I didn't know I had. I found joy I didn't think was possible. And most importantly, I found myself. If you're watching this right now and you're feeling lost, I want you to know something: you're going to be okay. It might not feel like it right now, but you are. Pain won't last forever. The hurt won't define you. You're stronger than you think, and you're capable of more than you realize. Take it from someone who's been there. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a challenge. Think about where you are right now. Think about the pain you're carrying, the struggles you're facing, and then ask yourself this: what's the first step I can take to move forward? It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something. Maybe it's reaching out to a friend. Maybe it's journaling your thoughts. Maybe it's joining a group or even starting one of your own. Whatever it is, take that step, and then take another and another. Before you know it, you'll look back and realize just how far you've come. And when you do, share your story, because your story matters. Your story can inspire others just like others have inspired you. Together we can build a world where no one has to go through their pain alone. If this video resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your story, or just let me know what stood out to you. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, please share it with them. You never know how much a simple act like that can mean to someone who's struggling. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories, tips, and inspiration. Your support helps us reach more people and continue sharing these messages of hope. Before I go, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for being a part of this journey. Life isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And no matter what you're going through, remember, this isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning of something new.